Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin, daf Kuf Chaf Aleph. It's the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started with going back to the Mishnah and the list of the items in the Mishnah that were discussed, where they're going to join together these parts of the body of the animal. We're going to join together with the meat to get to the kibetza requisite amount, the size of an egg, in order to pass on impurity, or perhaps even to become impure. So the first thing we're going to deal with is the alal. Remember, we had a discussion when we learned the Mishnah that wasn't clear exactly what this is. We defined it one way, but we're going to see it's a machloket between two Amoraim. My alal, what is alal? Rabbi Yochanan Amar, martika. Rabbi Yochanan says it's martika. Doesn't really help us. Rashi explains that it's a gid, it's a sinew in the shidra and the tzavar, in the backbone and the neck, which is very wide and white, and it's very hard, and it's not really eaten. However, it could theoretically be eaten with the meat. Barish Lakish Amar, basar shepalateto sakin. That's how we explained it. Gave that example of the salmon when I was taking off the skin of the salmon, and some of the salmon got onto the skin. That's the idea here. If you person cuts off the skin, and with it some meat, and generally it's thrown out, but since sometimes it might be eaten, so it could join with other meat to get to the requisite amount of impurity. We're going to talk about this later because either it's meat or it's not meat, or it's something you're going to throw in the garbage, and we're going to have to figure out exactly why this is in this in-between category. Today in general, I should just introduce by saying we're going to talk a lot about in-between categories, both in this sugya and in the other central sugya of today's daf. So now we're going to bring a difficulty on one of these interpretations from a pasuk, which raises an interesting question about, I took a course in university called Lashon Chachamim, the language of the rabbis, meaning this time period that we're studying, the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Hebrew language changes over time, just like most languages develop. And the words used in the Tanakh don't always have the same word usage or the same definitions, or other words might mean something else, right? Another different word might be used in a different time period to mean the same thing. There's difference between the languages. But right now, the Gemara is going to set up as a difficulty a pasuk from the Tanakh, pasuk from Eov, the book of Job. And the question is going to be, right, this definition, or whatever definition we could use for this pasuk, could not possibly fit with one of the explanations. Presume what we're going to see is Rish Lakishas. Metive is a word suggesting a difficulty. V'ulam atem tofle shekel, rofei Elul kulchem. So Eov says to his friends, if you remember, his friends are always trying to make him feel better about his tragedy that befell him. And he says to them, you're all speaking lies, and you're telling me lies, and you're trying to rofei Elul kulchem. You're healers of Elul. Now, what does Elul mean? It doesn't mean Elul. Usually it means an idol. You're healing something that cannot be healed. You're trying to fix, make me feel better. And I'm not going to, I've undergone a tragedy. I'm not capable of being healed. So he calls them Ruf'ei Elul, those who heal things that cannot be healed. So why is an Elul something that can't be healed? Bishlam alamand amar martika. Hainu delav barufuahu. What's a martika? It's a sinew. If you cut that sinew, there's nothing you can do. You can't fix it. So that makes sense. Ela lamanda amar, but according to Rish Lakish, who said basar shapalateto sakin, if it got cut off together with the hide, barafuahu. Now, if you take an animal that's alive and you slice off a piece of skin and then you leave it there, it'll eventually grow back, right? The skin will heal and the meat will become part back into the flesh of the animal, and everything will be fine. So it actually can be healed. So it can't possibly be Rish Lakish's definition. To which the Gemara answers, Ba'alal dikra kule amalu pligi. How to understand that pasuk? Everybody agrees that an Elul is something that cannot be healed. Even Rish Lakish agrees with that. But ki pligi ba'alal dematniti. But their machloket is about the alal in the Mishnah, as I mentioned before. Just because the language of Tanakh uses the word Elul in that manner doesn't mean that in the time of the rabbis they used the word alal in that manner. And it's even pronounced differently, if you notice, alal and Elul, but they assume it's one and the same root, maybe a different form of the word, but they say in the time of the Mishnah, that's not the way they use the word. And that's the way to resolve the difficulty. Now they're going to bring another source. And in fact, it's going to be the source in our Mishnah. Tashman, it's going to actually fit much better with Rish Lakish. Tashma Rabbi Yehuda Omer, you might remember at the end of the Mishnah they said, Ha'alal ha'mechunas, if you take a piece of the alal and you have a little bit of meat on it, right on this, we're going to now assume this means the skin because you'll see it's very hard to explain it otherwise. But let's just not define it yet. The alal ha'mechunas, if you have a bunch of pieces of alal together, im yesh kezayit b'makom echad chayavim alav. If you have a whole olive bulk in one place, then you're liable for it, meaning then it's going to be metame tumat ochlin. So Amar Rav Huna v'hu shekinso. Well, Rav Huna says, right? I'm sorry, it's going to be. I made a mistake. You're chayav alav mishum nevela. Okay, in other words, it's going to have a law of a nevela because you have a whole bunch of alal together and it makes up an olive bulk. So Amar Rav Huna. There's really no need for adding Rav Huna here, but we're going to add it anyway because whenever they bring this statement, they add Rav Huna's statement to this. Amar Rav Huna v'hu shekinso. Rav Huna says it's only if a person came and put them together. If they just happen to be a bunch of pieces lying together, that wouldn't make a difference. That wouldn't make it Tumah Nevela. Has to be that somebody put it there because they showed that they had intent for it to be there and they gave it significance. They made it into, oh, we're not just throwing these in the garbage. Now, we're going to see why this works much better according to Rish Lakish. If you say it's the meat that was attached to the hide, to the skin, well, that makes sense that you're going to say, if there's a kazayit, you're going to be obligated. It's ba'almahu. But if you say it's a bunch of pieces of sinew that all add up together, and as if you say it's meat that's on the flesh and all together you end up with a kazayit, an olive bulk of meat, we understand why it's going to have this impurity of a nevela. But if you have a bunch of pieces of sinews that add up to a kazayit altogether, who cares? They're eitz ba'alma. What is eitz ba'alma? They're like a tree. It's just like a tree. It's a hard piece of material that no one's even going to ever eat. So why would we say it has Tumah Nevela, which is really applicable only to flesh of an animal? So the Gemara answers, and that basically is a difficulty on Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara answers that leave it to Rabbi Yehuda lo plig. In explaining Rabbi Yehuda's line, nobody argues. For sure, we're going to have to explain it the way Rish Lakish did, which is basar shepalatato sakin. The hide that ends up, right, the hide with the meat stuck on it, right, the meat that basically got cut off with the skin when you were cutting the animal. Ki plige aliba de Rabbana, but the machloket is according to the rabbi's position, meaning the Tanakama. In the beginning of the Mishnah, when it mentions halal in that list of items that can combine with the meat to get to the requisite amount for impurity of food, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Martika Nami Mitzdarim. He says the word alal could mean what Rish Lakish explained, and it also could mean martika. We can use both definitions of the term. And Rish Lakish Amar Dafka Basar Shepalatato Sakin Aval Martika Lo Mitzdarim. And Rish Lakish will say, no, the sinew, that's not going to join together with meat. That's not really food at all. It's not something that's really edible. But the basar shepalatato sakin, the meat that was cut off with the skin, that will join together. Hi, basar shepalatato sakin hechidani. Okay, after bringing one difficulty on Rish Lakish and resolving it, another, that was from the pasuk, a difficulty on Rabbi Yochanan and resolving it, that was from the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda. Now we go back to explaining Rish Lakish and saying, wait a minute, something doesn't make so much sense according to Rish Lakish. This basar shepalatato sakin, the meat that came off with the knife, hechidami, what's the case? If the person said, I want to keep this, I'm going to scrape, I actually was thinking about it because a lot of salmon came off and I wanted to try to get some of the salmon off. So if I really want the meat, well, then afilu ba'am pei nafshe mitame. Forget about it joining together with meat. It in and of itself it's food, basically. If I want to use it as food, it's food. Idelo chashiv alei. If you remember, in laws of impurity, the intent of the person, whether they intend to use it or not intend to use it, is critical. That's the determining factor. Idelo chashiv alei bitule batle. And if I don't plan to, I plan to throw it in the garbage, well, then I nullified it, and then it can't even join together with meat. So how do we end up in this in-between where it's not important enough in and of itself to be considered meat, but it will join together along with meat? Okay? It doesn't make any sense because it either should be completely yes, food, or completely not food. How did we get to this in-between position? It makes no sense. To which Rabbi Avin and Rabbi Miyasha both have an answer, each a different one. We don't know who says what. Chan Amar, one of them said, Miktzatochi shevalaf. Part of it, the person thought I'm going to eat. In other words, I cut off a piece of skin. It ended up with some meat on it, and some of it I intended to cut off and use, and some of it I intended not to. Now, how do we get to this in between then? Why don't we just say the part I intended to keep is meat, and the part I didn't intend to keep is nothing? How we get to, well, it'll join together with meat, but it's not important in and of itself. It's not food in and of itself. Well, the commentaries answer that what he must be referring to is that I cut off this piece of meat with the skin. I plan to use, let's say, half of it, but I didn't say which half, and I plan to throw out half, but I didn't specify which half, and we don't know now which half, or it wasn't clear which half I meant. So half of it is actually would be matame tumat ochlin, and half of it definitely won't be. But because we don't know which half is which, so we treat it as this in-between stage. That's answer number one. V'chan amar, miksato plateto chaya, umiksato plateto sakin. Half of it was cut off by a chaya, by an animal, okay, while the animal was still alive. The word chaya here could mean either the animal was alive or was done by an animal. I think it actually means an animal cut it off, but either which way, we're going to explain it like this. Okay, both are true. It was an animal bit it off, but while the animal was still alive. So imagine a dog comes over, bites off a chunk of skin of this live animal. Now, he didn't bite it off completely. It's still partially attached. Now, what's the situation then? That meat, the flesh that's there, can actually heal and become, right? If you leave it on, bandage it up, right? It'll eventually go back to being part of the animal. So that is actually considered meat. But what happened? Before that happened, somebody came off and cut off with a knife that whole piece of hide and then some. So they cut off this piece of the hide of the animal, which has attached to it some meat that was already detached, and it has some meat that wasn't already detached. So you now have, again, a combo. You have half and half, and you're not sure which was which. You don't know which was part that the animal had bit off previously. So you end up with this combination of part that's actually considered real meat, part that's not considered anything because it's going to get thrown out, but because it's this combination, so we end up saying that it's matame tumat ochlin if it combines together with other meat. Okay, then it can carry on impurity of food. It's nanatam. Now we get to another Mishnah, which is going to relate to some of the cases in our Mishnah. Hachartom, which is the beak. Now that didn't appear in our Mishnah, but other things similar. The beak and atzipornaim and the talons of the bird, mitamim, umitamim, umitzdarfim. So they can carry impurity, they can pass on impurity, and they can join together. Chartom, to which the Gemara says, the beak, it's ba'albahu. That's not something anybody eats. You don't eat the beak of the bird. To which they answer, no, Amar Rabbi Elazar, bechartom taftom. We're talking about the lower part of the beak. To which the Gemara says, okay, that didn't help us. Tafton nami eats ba'almahu. Nobody eats the bottom part of the beak. Amar Rav Papa. So Rav Papa answers, tafton shel elyon. What he meant when he said lower, he meant the lower part of the upper part of the beak, which again, I'm not sure exactly what they mean, but it seems to mean that that part must be soft and must be somewhat edible. Again, it's something you might eat while you're eating the meat. If it's attached, you could theoretically eat it. Tzipornaim, the talons, right, the nails of the bird. Amar Rabbi Elazar, makom hamuvla'im babasal. It's the part of the nail that's together attached to the flesh, right? The part of the nail that's coming out is not at all the talon that's jutting out. It's not near the flesh at all. It's not going to join together with the meat. But the part that's right up against the flesh of the bird is going to be included. Again, that will be mitzdaref, this in between, that it joins together with meat, but it itself is not. Amar Rabbi Elazar, we said that already. Karnayim, what about the horns? Amar Rav Papa, b'makom shechotchim v'yotzei mehem dam. It's a place where if you cut the horns, blood will come out, again, meaning the place that's attached to the body and not the part that's jutting out. Now we're going to get to the second part of our sugya for today. So what we did in the first part was explain the alal, the tzipornaim. We added in the chartom, which wasn't in our Mishnah, the beak, and we got to the karnaim and the horns. Now we're going to move on to the second part of the Mishnah. The first part of the Mishnah that we saw on Daf Kuf Yud Zayin, if you remember, was the or, the rotev, the kifa, all those things. They're mitzdarfim, they join together for l'tamei tumat ochlin, but not tumat nevelot. Okay, but they won't have the impurity of a dead carcass. Now, then the Mishnah said kayotzebo, and likewise, we're going to have another parallel case where it's mitamei tumat ochlin, but not tumat nevelot. Okay, where it's going to have impurity of food, but it's not going to have the impurity of a carcass of a dead animal. And what's that case? Hashochet behemat me'ah le'ovei kochavim u'mifarkeset. Okay, if somebody slaughters, a Jew slaughters a kosher slaughter, slaughters a non-kosher animal, okay, performs a kosher slaughter to a non-kosher animal for a non-Jew who can actually eat the non-kosher animal. So at that point, now you have to remember, we're going to be discussing, again, we're talking about in-between stages. It's going to be the main topic of this section, which is the animal is still flailing. Now, in a kosher animal, as soon as the shechita is performed, even if the animal is still flailing, that animal is considered completely slaughtered and permitted to eat. However, if it's a non-kosher animal and a non-Jew slaughters it or kills it or however, it's not going to be considered food. And because, okay, let's go like this. What makes it considered food when it's permitted to eat? It's not permitted to eat until the animal stops flailing. Okay, by slaughtering it, by killing it, that doesn't do anything until, right, even if you killed it by uprooting the two simanim, the esophagus and the windpipe, it still is not going to be considered dead until the animal stops flailing. But now you have a weird case because you have a Jew who performed shechita. Now, when a Jew performs shechita in general, that makes the animal permitted to eat. And he does it on behalf for a non-Jew. So we're going to put this animal, it makes it this in-between status, that it's already be considered food because the Jew slaughtered it, even though it's a non-kosher animal, and the Jew can't eat it, but he slaughtered it for the intent of a non-Jew. And it was a kosher shechita, theoretically, even though it's not a kosher animal. But that's going to make it already have impurity of food, but not tumat nevelo. But it's not considered, it's a funny thing, we're going to consider it dead and not dead at the same time. And the Sugya is going to talk about this because it's obviously quite strange to consider something both dead and alive at the same time. So we have this situation, this unique situation, where the animal is dead enough to be considered tumat ochlin, impurity of food, but not dead enough to make it considered a dead carcass. So Amar Rabbi Asi, Shunim, so Rabbi Asi says there are Tanaim who say the following, who have the following source. Yisrael b'tme'ah, okay, which was the case that we just discussed, a Jew slaughtering a non-kosher animal for a non-Jew, ve'ovei kochavim b'tehora. And the flip case, which is going to have the same law, is a non-Jew who slaughters a kosher animal for a Jew. A non-Jew slaughter is not valid. So the Jew can't eat it. However, since the non-Jew did it for intent for the Jew to eat it, that gives it, again, status that there was a shechita done to it, even though it was a non-kosher shechita because it was a non-Jew, but it was done for a Jew and it was done with a proper shechita. Again, it's hard to call it proper shechita because it was done by someone who actually can't perform a proper shechita, but the person did do a proper shechita, and that's an ovei kochavim b'torah for a kosher animal for a Jew. Both of them, tzrichim machshava, they need intent, meaning the Jew had to intend it for the non-Jew, the non-kosher food, and the non-Jew had to intend the food for the Jew, but then it will have impurity of food. Now they add another thing, which the Gemara is going to struggle with, which is they need water to get upon it, though, to make it susceptible to impurity, or one of the 7 liquids. It's not going to become impure right away if somebody touches it. It has to have liquid come upon it first. From makom acher, meaning the blood of the slaughter isn't going to do it. That's because only the blood of a kosher, completely kosher shechita is going to do that. Because says by Shchita ala aretz tishpachenu kemayim, really you need water because ki utamayim al zera, that's what you need to create susceptibility to impurity when water gets on a seed. From there we learn water. How do we get blood? You might remember we learned this. We get blood from the Shchita pasuk, which says when you slaughter an animal, you have to spill the blood on the floor. So, like water, and there it calls blood like water, but that's only blood of a completely kosher shechita, and this is not a completely kosher shechita, because one was a Jew doing a non-kosher animal, and one was a non-Jew, which doesn't make it a kosher shechita. So you have kind of, again, another in-between scenario here, where it is a shechita for certain things, but it's not a shechita for other things. So that's why it needs water from somewhere else, or any of the 7 liquids from somewhere else, not the shechita. Okay, now we're going to have a side question about this hechsher lekat, right? The hechsher mayim, hechsher lamali. Why do I need that? It should become impure just on its own. Why? Without any sort of something making it susceptible to impurity, like a liquid, because there's a rule, which we're going to see in a minute. But they're going to say, "Sofo l'tamei tuma chamura." This animal right now was slaughtered, but it's still flailing. Okay, it's convulsing, not dead fully. But as soon as it finishes convulsing, it's going to be a dead carcass, because no matter how we look at it, the shechita wasn't a valid shechita. Either it was a Jew who slaughtered a non-kosher, which isn't going to be a kosher, so it's going to be an avela, and the non-Jew who slaughtered because the shechita is no good, even the kosher animal won't be valid shechita, it'll be called an avela. Now, once it gets to tumat avela, that's a tumat chamura, that's a more severe impurity than tumat ochlin, because remember, nevela is an avatuma. It in and of itself is a father of tuma, it's called, of impurity. It's one of the higher levels. It can pass on impurity to people, to vessels, whereas tumat ochlin is much lower. It can only be passed on to other foods and drink. And there's a rule. Anything that will ultimately get to a higher level of impurity doesn't need some liquid to get upon it to make it susceptible to impurity. So, and how do we know this? Because in the house of Rabbi Yishmael, they brought a bright. They quote the pasuk about if water gets upon seeds. Just like seeds. Has to be just like seeds. When do you need water? When it's like seeds. What's true about seeds? Well, they will never come to a higher level of impurity because they're always going to be food, and food can't ever get to that higher level of impurity. So just like the seeds is what needs, the whole pasuk about creating susceptibility to impurity is from that verse. So it has to be like that, which is something that will never come to a higher level of impurity. Vitanya, Amar Rabbi Yossi, and also in a Braita, Rabbi Yossi said, Mipnei ma amru nevelat of tahor tzricha machshava ve'enat tzricha hechsher. Why did they say that the carcass of a kosher bird needs intent? Which Rashi explains is if a sheretz touches it and it's going to become impure because it's food, well, it needs to have intent that someone actually intended to eat that bird. Okay, we're talking about that there was intent. Rashi says we're talking about a place where there were people that were poor, and in the poor villages, they didn't generally eat birds. So because they didn't generally eat birds, unless someone intended to eat the bird, it wouldn't actually have impurity of food. Okay, that's a complete side point, not relevant to our topic. So it doesn't need hechsher. This is the important part. The nevelat of tahor doesn't need hechsher. Turning out amibet, because ultimately it will be metame tum'ah chamura. Ultimately, it will come to this higher level of impurity because it will become an avela. Okay, so in other words, the nevelat of tahor that, let's say, was flailing, okay, doesn't need hechsher because it's ultimately become a dead carcass. So what do you see here? You see that anything that will come to later become a higher level of impurity, like a nevela, so while it's flailing and it's not yet there and it has this status of food impurity, well, it won't, again, it doesn't need hechsher because it will ultimately come to this stage. So now we have a difficulty on what Rabbi Asi said that people say, which is it needs hechsher mimakom acher. To which Amar Chizkiah, what do you mean? It won't necessarily become an avela, this animal that we slaughtered and is flailing, because you could theoretically start shredding it, cutting it into small pieces while it's flailing, It sounds a little extreme that's what you're going to be doing right then. But since there's a potential, if you cut it into small pieces, that each one is less than an olive bulk, it will never get to the impurity of a nevela. In order for something to be an impurity of a nevela, has to be a piece that's a kizayit of meat. And this could be theoretically cut up before while it's still flailing into very small pieces. So it's not necessarily going to come to tumat nevela. It's not so clearly it will end up being a nevela. And therefore, since it could maybe never become a nevela, it needs to have a liquid come upon it to make it susceptible to impurity. Now we're going to go back to ask a question. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah le Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah now asks Rabbi Zera a question. Umi amar Chizkiah hachi? Did Chizkiah really say this? He says, well, Chizkiah said it doesn't make any sense. V'ha'itmar, wasn't it said? Shachat bashnayim o rov shnayim, v'adayin hi mefarkeset. If someone slaughters two of the simanim, which means a kosher shlita, or the majority of two, which is also a kosher shlita, v'adayin hi mefarkeset, and Rashi helps us and tells us we're talking about a non-kosher animal, meaning a Jew slaughters a non-kosher animal, exactly our case. Chizkiah amar, now we're going to have a machlokah Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. Is there a problem of Aver min achai? Well, it's at this in-between stage, and I cut off a limb. Is it going to be a problem of Aver min achai? So Chizkiah amar einala evarim. There's no problem of Aver min achai. It's basically dead. Rabbi Yochanan, even though it's still flailing. Rabbi Yochanan amar yeshna levarim. There is a prohibition of Aver min achai, of taking off a limb from a live animal, because it's still alive. Again, this is exactly discussing the problematic nature of this scenario. We have an animal, again, that was properly slaughtered, but it was slaughtered for a non-Jew, not for a Jew. So and it's a non-kosher animal. Normally, for a non-kosher animal to be considered dead, you need it to be completely dead, not still flailing. But when a kosher shechita is done to a kosher animal, it becomes completely dead, okay, while it's still flailing as soon as the two simanim are done. So we have this in-between case where it's a Jew who did a kosher shechita, but to a non-kosher animal for a non-Jew. So where are you going to put that? So they each put it in a different place. Now, the problem is the Chizkiah is going to contradict what he just said before. Chizkiah amar eina levarim meitahi, because he views this animal as dead, and that's why he says there's no problem of Aver min achai. It's already dead because you did a proper shechita, even though it's still flailing, and even though if a non-Jew had killed an animal, right, or even slaughtered an animal for him or herself, it wouldn't be considered dead yet. But since the Jew did a kosher shechita for the non-Jew, it's already considered dead for the purposes of Aver min achai. And Rabbi Yochanan amar yeshna levarim. There is a problem of prohibition of Aver min achai because lav meitei, because it's not yet considered dead. So anyway, what's the problem? If Chizkiah says, listen, it needs susceptibility to impurity because it's not going to necessarily become a nevela, because maybe you'll cut it up before, because it's still flailing. He clearly views the animal as still alive. So how can he view the animal as still alive and also view the animal as still dead when it comes to Aver min achai? To which Rabbi Zera answers, a very interesting answer, Amalei yatstal michlal chaya u'lechlal meta lo bat. Well, it's no longer alive, but it's also not yet dead. Okay, so again, it's a fascinating topic here. We're reviewing this animal as both alive and dead at the same time. Okay, so again, it's not alive and dead for the same issues. We're going to view it as dead for the purposes of tumat ochlin. And now for this issue of will it ever become a nevela, Chizkiah views it also as it's actually still alive. But when it comes to the issue of Aver min achai, we're going to view it as dead. Dead enough that you could take a limb off and eat it. Goof. Now we're going to go back to this line that we said before, and we're going to quote the machlokah between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan about Aver min achai. Shachat bashnayim o rov shnayim v'adayin hi mefarkeset. So this is just a complete review of what we just said. If you slaughter two simanim, the trachea and the windpipe, the trachea and the esophagus, or the gullet and the esophagus in the animal, shachat bashnayim o rov shnayim v'adayin hi, the gullet and the windpipe, out of my lingo from back earlier in our Masechet. Shachat bashnayim o rov shnayim v'adayin hi mefarkeset. If you slaughtered two or the majority of two simanim and adayin hi mefarkeset, and it's still flailing, Chizkiah amar eina levarim. It's not a problem of Aver min achai. It's considered dead for those purposes. Rabbi Yochanan amar yeshna levarim. There is an issue. Amar Rabbi Elazar nikol lahad Rabbi Yochanan biyadach. Rabbi Elazar says, stick with what Rabbi Yochanan says. Remember, he was his prize student. Did Tani, but not just because he was a student, but he said, I'm going to prove Rabbi Yochanan from the following Braita. We're now going to start a very long Braita. Did Tani Rav Oshaya Kavate, because Rav Oshaya has a Braita that's just like Rabbi Yochanan. Did Tani Rav Oshaya, this is the Braita that Rav Oshaya brought. Yisrael sheshachat behemat tmea lovei kochavim. That's our case. A Jew slaughters an animal, non-kosher animal, for a non-Jew. Shachat b'shnayim urov shnayim u'mefarkeset, cuts two of the simanim, right? Slaughters it properly, or the majority of the two, of the esophagus and the windpipe. Mitam'at tuma'at ochalin avalot tuma'at nevelot. So this creates impurity of food, but not impurity of a carcass. That's exactly what we saw so far. That everyone agrees with. But here comes the Aver min achai. Aver haporesh mimena kiporesh min achai. A limb that's cut off from there is as if it's coming from a live animal, like Rabbi Yochanan said. There's the proof. Ubasar poresh mimena kibasar poresh min achai. And the flesh that comes off there is like flesh from a live animal, meaning all that can't be eaten. V'asur lebnei Noach, and the bnei Noach can't eat it either, because bnei Noach can't eat Aver min achai. V'afilu la'achar shetetzeh nafsha. And eat, now, obviously, a Jew can't eat, it's not a kosher animal. But even a ben Noach, a Noachide, can't eat it, even after the animal dies. Okay, meaning you might have thought, well, if it's cut off while the animal was flailing, maybe once the animal's dead, it can be eaten. No, can't ever be eaten because it was taken off the animal when the animal was still considered alive. I say considered because the shechita was already done, but it's not enough for that purpose. Now, the Braita is going to continue. That already proved what we wanted to prove, but we have a long Braita. Shachat be'echad or rov echad. What if only one of the simanim, let's say just the windpipe, was cut, or the majority of the windpipe? Eina mitama tumat ochlin. Now at this point, it's not a kosher shechita, so it's not going to be considered food because the Jew, right? Remember, it's still flailing. So because it's still flailing and a kosher shechita wasn't done, then it's not susceptible to impurity for food. Nichara, or if it was stabbed, which is also not a proper shechita, and batuma shel klum, it has no type of impurity at all. That's case one in the Braita. Okay, there's two parts of case one. A proper shechita was done or a proper shechita wasn't done. But the first case is a Jew slaughtering a non-kosher animal for a non-Jew. Now we're going to do the exact same thing. The Braita is going to go through the parallel case, which we've already discussed that it's parallel, and we're going to see exactly word for word everything is the same. Ovei kochavim, if a non-Jew, sheshachat behema Torah, took a kosher animal, did a kosher shechita to it, even though it's not really a kosher shechita, just like the Jews wasn't a kosher shechita because it wasn't even a kosher animal, but the actual act of shechita was kosher. Here we're going to have the same thing where a non-Jew, which his shechita is not going to be good anyway, but he performs technically a kosher shechita for a Jew on a kosher animal. Well, umefarkeset, and the animal is still convulsing. There's going to be impurity of food because it was intended for a Jew to eat, and a shechita was done, even though, again, it's not actually kosher, but it will be considered food because of the intent of the non-Jew. But it won't carry the impurity of a dead carcass because the animal is still convulsing. Same law. A limb, therefore, taken off this animal, or flesh from this animal, will be as if it came from a live animal. Vasur libnei Noach, and it's forbidden to a ben Noach, Noachide, afilu la'achar shetetzeh nafsha. Even after the body is, the soul comes out, and after the animal is completely dead, since it was cut off at the earlier stage, you're not allowed to eat it. Shachat be'echad or rov echad, again, same thing as the other case. The second stage was if you slaughtered one of the simanim, or the majority of one, it doesn't carry the impurity of food. Nichara, and if it was stabbed, it has no impurity whatsoever. Okay, that was case number, right? The two cases of case number one, the two options, and the two options within case number two. Now we're going to go, the Braita is going to continue on to other cases. I told you, it's a very long Braita. Shachat ovei kochabim b'makom she'en osino ta'trefa. If the non-Jew slaughtered it in a place where it doesn't make it a treifa, he began to slaughter it, meaning he didn't cut enough. Let's say he takes the gullet and he starts cutting. If you remember, the windpipe, if you cut any bit of it, it already makes the animal a treifa. But the gullet, if you start to cut under half of it, then it's actually not going to be a treifa yet. So if he cut less than half, Uba Yisrael U'Gmaran, the Jew came and finished it up and made it the majority, okay, and presumably also did the other siman, kshera. Okay, so now the Jew came along and finished up the shchita, it's actually completely kosher. Shachat Yisrael bein b'makom she'oseh otah treifa, ubein b'makom she'en oseh otah treifa. Now, if the Jew did it, whether he made the animal a treifa by starting, right, making a nick in the veshet, or if it doesn't make it a treifa, like in the kaneh, in the windpipe, and he cuts part of it, in the esophagus, cuts part of it. No, sorry, I'm confusing them. Wow, I really got confused. I lost my English wording and which goes with what. Okay, there's the veshet and the kaneh. The kaneh is the windpipe. The windpipe, if you cut part of it but not the whole thing, it's not an issue. The gullet is where if you cut a little bit of it, it's a problem. Sorry for my confusion. Uba oved kochavim uvegamao shchitato psula. Now again, if the non-Jew comes over and finishes up the shchita is disqualified. Okay, so the main point being that if the non-Jew is the one who actually does the act of the shchita, here it doesn't matter if the Jew made a treifa before, obviously it's not good. But even if the Jew wouldn't have made it a treifa by his action, by cutting less than half of the kaneh, the windpipe, then still the shchita is going to be invalid because the non-Jew is the one finishing it and doing the real act that turned it into a shchita, so it's not going to be able to be eaten. That's a side point, right? Not relevant to our issue. The Braita continues. If you want to eat from an animal, why you want to do this, we're going to see later that it actually is, people thought this was healthy. To eat a part of an animal when the animal still has life in it, which we generally can't do because of Ever Menachai, well, there is something you could do. If you take this animal that was slaughtered, but it's still flailing, so you take a kezayit of the meat from where the neck is, you salt it very well, you rinse it very well, that was talked about to get out the blood. Now you have to still wait till the life goes out of the animal completely, but you can actually cut it before you can eat it. So let's just go through stages. The shchita is done, the animal's still convulsing. You start cutting off parts from the neck while the animal is still convulsing and still somewhat alive. And then you have to wait till the animal's dead, though, to actually eat it. And obviously you have to salt it in between anyway, but you have to wait till the animal's completely dead in order to eat it. Okay, so non-Jews and Jews are allowed to eat this meat. Okay, they can eat the meat that was taken off the animal while the animal was still convulsing. Remember, the non-Jew is really not supposed to eat. The shechita is not considered good even if valid shechita until the animal is completely dead. But if a kosher shechita was done and you cut off the meat before and waited till the animal died, even the non-Jew could eat it as well. Now, this supports, this last line of the Braita supports what Rav Idi bar Avin said, Rav Idi bar Avin, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Ashyan, if you want to get better from some disease or you want to eat something healthy, you take an olive bulk of meat from where the neck is, where it was slaughtered. You salt it, you rinse it. You wait until the animal is completely dead. So both a Jew and a non-Jew could eat this. You see that the Braita supported the statement of Rav Idi bar Avin, who is an Amora, came later, and here we bring a Braita to support his statement. So that was all this long Braita that we brought because we mentioned it, and then they said, well, right, we mentioned this Machloket, Rabbi Yochanan, and Chizkiah, within that, we brought Rav Oshaya said, I can prove it, Rabbi Yochanan's position from this Braita, and we brought this whole long Braita with all the different details. Okay, so we already have that. We have this scale between alive and dead. The animal's partially dead, but also partially alive. So it's mitame tumat ochlin, not nevela. That was clear from the Mishnah. We had a debate about Ever Menachai, whether it's dead enough to be able to allow a limb that was taken off of it or not. And now we're going to talk about some other halachot that are relevant. So is this animal alive or is it dead? And with the kosher shchita, right, how does that affect things? Now, the first question is by Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar asked, Shahaba daras b'mahu. Now, when we said if a kosher shechita was done by a Jew on a non-kosher animal for a non-Jew, that would actually make it already have impurity of food, or if the non-Jew does kosher shechita on a kosher animal for a Jew. But now the Gemara asks, what if how kosher does the shechita need to be? Have to be completely kosher? What if there was a waiting period in between? Or darasba, or he pushed down with a lot of force and cut it rather than a back and forth motion. These are all the disqualifications we learned about in the beginning of the Masechet, and presumably his question was about all 5 of them, not just the first 2, or these 2. Ma. So would it be Matame Tumat Ochlin? Amalei Ahu Saba, an elderly man came along and said, Hachi Am Rabbi Yochanan, this is what Rabbi Yochanan said, Tzricha Hechsher Shlita Kebehema Torah. It needs to be completely a kosher shlita. So it doesn't work if it's not a kosher shlita. Now he uses a strange word here, Hechsher Shlita. It should have said Tzricha Shlita Kebehema Torah, or a kosher shlita. What's Hechsher Shlita? Hechsher Shlita is like something that permits the shlita. It's not really clear. So Hechsher Lamai, what do they mean? What does Rabbi Yochanan mean by Hechsher? It even needs, you might remember, the knife has to be checked before to make sure there's no nicks, to make sure that it doesn't end up making the animal a treifa before it actually slaughters it properly. Comes Rabbi Zera now with a good question. I don't know, good question, but an interesting question. Now, again, is the animal alive or is the animal dead? Now, if the animal's alive and the animal swallowed a ring and walked into a house where there's a dead body, so does the animal protect the ring? This is called tum'ah blu'ah. We learned about this. Tum'ah that's absorbed in the body of something. Does it protect it from impurity? So that when the ring eventually comes out of the animal, let's say it's no longer in the house, and the ring comes out, will the ring be impure? So if the animal is alive, then the animal protects the ring from becoming impure. That's called tum'ah blu'ah, is protected by the live animal. However, if the animal's dead, and it's just like a piece of food, and there's a ring inside, it doesn't protect it. So if the animal's dead, remember, it's still convulsing after the slaughter was done, slaughter to a non-kosher animal for a non-Jew, or slaughter of a kosher animal, but the slaughter was done by a non-Jew. So what about tumah blu'ah? Let's say the animal is in a house and it has a ring in it. So Shmuel says, is it considered alive to protect it from anything absorbed inside? Okay, that's what Rabbi Zera asked Rav Sheshet. Would it protect things that are absorbed inside? So Rav Sheshet said, what kind of an absurd question? If it's metamatum ochlin, then it's considered food. So how could it be also protect? If it's food, it's not going to protect, like I said before. Rav Zera said, no, I still have my question, because but lo tatzil, what do you mean? You might say it's tumat ochlin, but it's not tumat nevelot. If it was really dead, it would be a status of a carcass of a dead animal. And it's not. So maybe it does protect. Maybe it's considered alive for this purpose. To which Abai answers the question, Amar Abai, it doesn't protect. It's considered dead for this purpose. Because it's considered food. Once it's considered food, it's not going to protect what's inside it. But on a different law, now I'm going to finish the last issue. But if one engages in bestiality with this animal while it's still convulsing, they will be obligated. Because it's not completely dead, because it doesn't have impurity of a carcass. So if we go on this line again of definitely it's metamatum ochlin. Is it also, Abaye says, it's also considered dead for the purposes of it doesn't protect anything that's inside its body from impurity. Middle, we have Ever Menachai. We have a machloket, Rabbi Yochanan and Chizkiah. Rov'ah, if engaged in bestiality, Abaye says it's already like it's dead, and Nevela, it's like it's still alive, and you're going to be obligated. And in terms of Tomat Nevela, it's considered still alive, and therefore there's no impurity of a dead body. So that's our scale of what we did, and that's the summary of this section. Summary of the first part, we had the halal, which is the 2 definitions, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. We had 2 difficulties, one on Rish Lakish, one on Rabbi Yochanan, one from a pasuk, one from our Mishnah, and then resolved them both. And then we moved on to the definitions of the chartom, the tzipornaim, and the other things mentioned in the Mishnah, the karnaim, what we're referring to. And then we got to this other sugya about the 2 cases of the Jew who slaughters for a non-Jew, or the non-Jew slaughters a kosher animal for a Jew, and the fact that even though they can't be eaten, but if they're still convulsing, they at this in-between stage, and that was what I just summarized, for all the different things. They're both considered dead and alive for different issues. Very interesting to think about and get your head around. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.